American Men of Mind by Burton Egbert Stevenson. Chapter 2, Writers of Prose, Part 2. It may be questioned whether America has produced any poet or novelist or essayist of the very first rank, but in another branch of letters, 4 names appear, which stand as high as any on the scroll. The writing of history is not, of course, pure literature. It is semi-creative rather than creative, and yet, at its best, it demands a high degree of imaginative insight. It appears at its best in the works of Prescott, Motley, Bancroft, and Parkman. George Bancroft was, of this quartet, the most widely known half a century ago because he chose as his theme the history of America and because he was himself for many years prominent in the political life of the country. Born in Massachusetts in 1800, graduating from Harvard, and, after a course of study in Germany, resolving to be a historian, he returned to America and began work on his history, the first volume of which appeared in 1834. 3 years later came the second volume, and in 1840 the third. Glowing with national spirit as they did, they attracted public attention to him, and he was soon drawn into politics. During the next 12 years, he held several government positions, among them Secretary of the Navy and Minister to England, which gave him access to great masses of historical documents. It was not until 1852 that his 4th volume appeared. Then 5 more followed at comparatively frequent intervals. Again, politics interrupted. He was sent as minister to Prussia and later to the German Empire, again largely increasing his store of original documents, with which, toward the last, he seems to have been fairly overburdened. In 1874, he published his 10th volume, bringing his narrative through the Revolution, and 8 years later, the last 2 dealing with the adoption of the Constitution. His last years were spent in revising and correcting this monumental work. It is an inspiring record, a life devoted consistently to one great work, and that work the service of one's country, for such Bancroft's really was. Every student of colonial and revolutionary America must turn to him, and while his history has long since ceased to be generally read, it maintains an honored place among every collection of books dealing with America. It is easily first among the old school histories as produced by such men as Hildreth, Tucker, Palfrey, and Sparks. At the head of the other school, which has been called cosmopolitan because it sought its subjects abroad rather than at home, stands William Hickling Prescott. Of this school, Washington Irving may fairly be said to have been the pioneer. We have seen how his residence in Spain turned his attention to the history of that country and resulted in 3 notable works. Prescott, however, was a historian by forethought and not by accident. Before his graduation from Harvard, he had determined to lead a literary life modeled upon that of Edward Gibbon. His career was almost wrecked at the outset by an unfortunate accident which so impaired his sight that he was unable to read or to write except with the assistance of a cumbrous machine. That any man laboring under such a disability should yet persevere in pursuing the rocky road of the historian seems almost unbelievable. Yet that is just what Prescott did. Let us tell the story of that accident. It was while he was at Harvard in his junior year. One day, after dinner, in the Commons Hall, some of the boys started a rude frolic. Prescott took no part in it, but just as he was leaving, a great commotion behind him caused him to turn quickly, and a hard piece of bread, thrown undoubtedly at random, struck him squarely and with great force in the left eye. He fell unconscious and never saw out of that eye again. Worse than that, his other eye soon grew inflamed and became almost useless to him, besides causing him, from time to time, the most acute suffering. But in spite of all this, he persisted in his determination to be a historian. After careful thought, he chose for his theme that period of Spanish history dominated by Ferdinand and Isabella, and went to work. Documents were collected, an assistant read to him for hours at a time, notes were taken, and the history painfully pushed forward. The result was a picturesque narrative which was at once successful both in Europe and America. And, thus encouraged, Prescott selected another romantic theme, the conquest of Mexico, for his next work. Following this came the history of the conquest of Peru, and finally, a history of the reign of Philip II, upon which he was at work when a paralytic stroke ended his career. Prescott was fortunate not only in his choice of subjects, but in the possession of a picturesque and fascinating style, which has given his histories a remarkable vogue. Fault has been found with him on the ground of historical inaccuracy, but such criticism is, for the most part, unjustified. His thoroughness, his judgment, and his critical faculty stand unimpeached and place him very near the head of American historians. Prescott's successor, in more than one sense, was John Lothrop Motley, a Bostonian and Harvard man. Well trained, after one or two unsuccessful ventures in fiction, he turned his attention to history, and in 1856 completed his Rise of the Dutch Republic, for which he could not find a publisher. He finally issued it at his own expense, with no little inward trembling, but it was at once successful, and 17,000 copies of it were sold in England alone during the first year. It received unstinted praise, and Motley at once proceeded with his History of the United Netherlands. The opening of the Civil War, however, recalled his attention to his native land. He was drawn into politics and did not complete his history until 1868. 6 years later appeared his John of Barneveld, but his health was giving way, and the end came in 1877. In brilliancy, dramatic instinct, and power of picturesque narration, Motley was Prescott's equal, if not his superior. The glow and fervor of his narrative have never been surpassed. His characters live and breathe. He was thoroughly in sympathy with the subject, and found a personal pleasure in exalting his heroes and unmasking his villains. But there was his weakness, for often, instead of the impartial historian, he became a partisan of this cause or that, and painted his heroes whiter and his villains blacker than they really were. In spite of that, or perhaps because of it, because of the individual and intensely earnest personal point of view, his histories are as absorbing and fascinating as any in the world. The last of this noteworthy group of historians, Francis Parkman, is also, in many respects, the greatest. He combined the virtues of all of them, and added for himself methods of research which have never been surpassed. Through it all, too, he battled against a persistent ill health, which unfitted him for work for months on end, and, even at the best, would permit his reading or writing only a few minutes at a time. Like the others, Parkman was born in Boston, and as a boy was so delicate that he was allowed to run wild in the country, acquiring a love of nature which is apparent in all his books. In search of health, he journeyed westward from St. Louis in 1846, living with Indians and trappers and gaining a minute knowledge of their ways. The results of this journey were embodied in a modest little volume called The Oregon Trail, which remains the classic source of information concerning the Far West at that period. Upon his return to the East, he settled down in earnest to the task which he had set himself, a history, in every phase, of the struggle between France and England for the possession of the North American continent. Years were spent in the collection of material, and in 1865 appeared his Pioneers of France in the New World, followed at periods of a few years by the other books completing the series, which ends with the story of Montcalm and Wolfe. The series is a masterpiece of interpretive history. Every phase of the struggle for the continent is described in minute detail and with the intimate touch of perfect knowledge. Every actor in the great drama is presented with incomparable vividness, and its scenes are painted with a color and atmosphere worthy of Prescott or Motley, and with absolute accuracy. His work satisfies at once the student and the lover of literature, standing almost unique in this regard. His flexible and charming style is a constant joy, his power of analysis and presentment a constant wonder, and throughout his work there is a freshness of feeling, an air of the open, at once delightful and stimulating. He said the last word concerning the period which his histories cover, and has lent to it a fascination and absorbing interest which no historian has surpassed. The boy or girl who has not read Parkman's histories has missed one of the greatest treats which literature has to offer. Other historians there are who have done good service to American letters and whose work is outranked only by the men we have already mentioned. John Bach McMaster, whose History of the People of the United States is still uncompleted. James Ford Rhodes, who has portrayed the Civil War period with admirable exhaustiveness and accuracy. Justin Windsor, Woodrow Wilson, William M. Sloane, and John Fiske. John Fiske's work, which deals wholly with the different periods of American history, is especially suited to young people because of its simplicity and directness, and because, while accurate, it is not overburdened with detail. We have said that during the colonial period of American history, most of the New England divines devoted a certain amount of attention to the cosmopolitan of creaking verse. More than that, they composed histories, biographies, and numberless works of a theological character which probably constitute the dullest mass of reading ever produced upon this earth. The Revolution stopped this flood, if anything so dry can be called a flood, and when the Revolution ended, public thought was for many years occupied with the formation of the new nation. But in the second quarter of the 19th century, there arose in New England a group of writers who are known as transcendentalists, and who produced one of the most important sections of American literature. Transcendentalism is a long word, and it is rather difficult to define, but to put it as briefly as possible, it was a protest against narrowness in intellectual life, a movement for broader culture, and for a freer spiritual life. It took a tremendous grip on New England, beginning about 1830, and kept it for nearly 40 years. For New England has always been more or less provincial, provincialism being the habit of measuring everything by one inadequate standard. The high priest of the Transcendental movement was Amos Bronson Alcott, born on a Connecticut farm in 1799, successively in youth a clockmaker, peddler, and book agent, and finally driven by dire necessity to teaching school. But there could be no success at school teaching for a man the most eccentric of his day, a mystic, a follower of Oriental philosophy, a non-resistant, an advocate of woman suffrage, an abolitionist, a vegetarian, and heaven knows what besides. So in the end, he was sold out and removed with his family to Concord, where he developed into a sort of impractical idealist, holding Orphic conversations and writing scraps of speculation and criticism and living in the clouds generally. Life would have been far less easy for him but for the development of an unexpected talent in one of his daughters, Louisa May Alcott. From her 16th year, Louisa Alcott had been writing for publication, but with little success, although every dollar she earned was welcome to a family so poor that the girls sometimes thought of selling their hair to get a little money. She also tried to teach, and finally, in 1862, went to Washington as a volunteer nurse and labored for many months in the military hospitals. The letters she wrote to her mother and sisters were afterwards collected in a book called Hospital Sketches. At last, at the suggestion of her publishers, she undertook to write a girl's story. The result was Little Women, which sprang almost instantly into a tremendous popularity, and which at once put its author out of reach of want. Other children's stories, scarcely less famous, followed in quick succession, forming a series which has never been equaled for long-continued vogue. Few children who read at all have failed to read Little Men, Little Women, An Old-Fashioned Girl, Eight Cousins, and Rose in Bloom, to mention only 5 of them, and edition after edition has been necessary to supply a demand which shows no sign of lessening. The stories are, one and all, sweet and sincere and helpful, and while they are not in any sense literature, they are, at least, an interesting contribution to American letters. But, to return to the Transcendentalists, the most picturesque figure of the group was Margaret Fuller. Starting as a morbid and sentimental girl, her father's death seems suddenly to have changed her, at the age of 25, into a talented and thoughtful woman. Her career need not be considered in detail here, since it was significant more from the inspiration she gave others than from any achievement of her own. She proved herself a sympathetic critic, if not a Catholic, an authoritative one, and a pleasing and suggestive essayist. What she might have become, no one can tell, for her life was cut short at the 40th year. She had spent some years in Italy, in an epoch of revolutions into which she entered heart and soul. A romantic marriage in 1847 with the Marquis Ossoli served further to identify her with the revolutionary cause, and when it tumbled into ruins, she and her husband escaped from Rome and started for America. Their ship encountered a terrific storm off Long Island, was driven ashore, broken to pieces by the waves, and both she and her husband were drowned. By far the greatest of the transcendental group and one of the most original figures in American literature was Ralph Waldo Emerson, a figure indeed in many ways unique in all literature. Born in Boston in 1803, the son of a Unitarian clergyman and a member of a large and sickly family, he followed the predestined path through Harvard College, graduating with no special honors, entered the ministry, and served as pastor of the Second Church of Boston until 1832. Then, finding himself ill at ease in the position, he resigned, and, settling at Concord, turned to lecturing, first on scientific subjects and then on manners and morals. His reputation grew steadily, and especially in the generation younger than himself, he awakened the deepest enthusiasm. In 1836, the publication of a little volume called Nature gave conclusive evidence of his talent, and, followed as it was by his essays, Representative Men, and Conduct of Life, established his reputation as seer, interpreter of nature, poet, and moralist, a reputation which has held its own against the assaults of time. And yet no personality could be more puzzling or elusive. He was at once attractive and repulsive. There was a certain line which no one crossed, a charmed circle in which he dwelt alone. There was about him a certain coldness and detachment, a self-sufficiency and a prudence which held him back from giving himself unreservedly to any cause. He lacked heart and temperament. He was a homely, shrewd, and cold-blooded Yankee, to put it plainly. Yet, with all that, he was a serene and benignant figure of an inspiring optimism, a fine patriotism, and profound intellect, a stimulator of the best in man. Upon this basis, probably, his final claim to memory will rest. Another transcendental eccentric with more than a touch of genius was Henry David Thoreau, and it is noteworthy that his fame, which burned dimly enough during his life, has flamed ever brighter and brighter since his death. This increase of reputation is no doubt due, in some degree, to the return to nature, which has recently been so prominent in American life, and which has gained a wide hearing for so noteworthy a poet-naturalist. But it is also due in part to a growing recognition of the fact that as a writer of delightful, suggestive, and inspiring prose, he has had few equals. Thoreau is easily our most extraordinary man of letters. Born in Concord of a poor family, but managing to work his way through Harvard, he spent some years teaching. But an innate love of nature and of freedom led him to seek some form of livelihood which would leave him as much his own master as it was possible for a poor man to be. To earn money for any other purpose than to provide for one's bare necessities was to Thoreau a grievous waste of time. So it came about that for many years he was a sort of itinerant tinker, a doer of odd jobs. Another characteristic, partly innate and partly cultivated, was a distrust of society and a dislike of cities. "I find it, as ever, very unprofitable to have much to do with them," he wrote. And finally, in pursuance of this idea, he built himself a little cabin on the shore of Walden Pond, where he lived for some 2 years and a half. It was there that his best work was done, for at bottom Thoreau was a man of letters rather than a naturalist, with the most seeing eye man ever had. Walden, or Life in the Woods, and A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers contain the best of Thoreau, and any boy or girl who is interested in the great outdoors, as every boy and girl ought to be, will enjoy reading them. The last of the transcendental group worthy of mention here is George William Curtis, a versatile and charming personality, not a genius in any sense, but a writer of pleasant and amusing prose, an orator of no small ability, and one of the truest patriots who ever loved and labored for his country. It is in this latter aspect, rather than as the author of Nile Notes and the Potiphar Papers, that Curtis is best remembered today. The books that he produced have, to a large extent, lost their appeal, but the work he did during the dark days of Reconstruction and after entitles him to admiring and grateful remembrance. It is scarcely possible to close a chapter upon American prose writers without referring to at least one of the great editors who have done so much to mold American public opinion. To James Gordon Bennett and Charles A. Dana, only passing reference need be made, but Horace Greeley deserves more extended treatment. Early in the last century, on a rocky little farm in New Hampshire, lived a man by the name of Zacchaeus Greeley, a good neighbor but a bad manager. So bad that in 1820, when his son Horace was 9 years old, the farm was seized by the sheriff and sold for debt. The proceeds of the sale did not pay the debt, and so, in order to escape arrest, for they imprisoned people for debt in those days, Zacchaeus Greeley fled across the border into Vermont, where his family soon joined him. He managed to make a precarious living by working at odd jobs, in which, of course, the boy joined him whenever he could be of any use. He was a rather remarkable boy, with a great fondness for books, and when he was 11 years old, he tried to get a position in a printing office, but was rejected because he was too young. 4 years later, he heard that a boy was wanted in an office at East Pulteney, and he hastened to apply for the position. He was a lank, ungainly, and dull-appearing boy, and the owner of the office did not think he could ever learn to be a printer, but finally put him to work, with the understanding that he was to receive nothing but his board and clothes for the first 6 months, and after that, $40 a year additional. The boy soon showed an unusual aptitude for the business, and finally decided that the little village was too restricted a field for his talents. With youth's sublime confidence, he decided to go to New York City. He managed to get a position in a printing office there, and 2 years later, at the age of 22, he and a partner established the first 1-cent daily newspaper in the United States. It was ahead of the times, however, and had to be abandoned after a few months. But he had discovered his peculiar field, and in 1840 he established another paper which he called the Log Cabin, in which he supported William Henry Harrison through the famous Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign. The paper was a success, and in the year following he established the New York Tribune, which was destined to make him both rich and famous. For more than 30 years he conducted the Tribune, making it the most influential paper in the country. He became the most powerful political writer in the United States, and in every village, groups gathered regularly to receive their papers and to see what old Horace had to say. He was to his readers a strong and vivid personality. They had faith in his intelligence and honesty, and they believed that he would say what he believed to be right, regardless of whose toes were pinched. It was as different as possible to the anonymous journalism of today, when not 1 in 100 of a newspaper's readers knows anything about the personality of the editor. We have already referred to the fact that at the beginning of secession, Greeley doubted the right of the North to compel the seceding states to remain in the Union. Indeed, he counseled peaceful separation rather than war, as did many others, but he was later a staunch supporter of President Lincoln's policy. We have also spoken of the fact that when Grant was renominated for president in 1872, a large section of the party, believing him incompetent, broke away from the party and named a candidate of their own. The party they formed was called the Liberal Republican, and their candidate was Horace Greeley. They managed to secure for him the support of the Democratic Convention, which placed him at the head of the Democratic ticket. But they could not secure the support of the Democrats themselves, who could not forget that Greeley had been fighting them all his life, and the result was that he was overwhelmingly defeated. He had not expected such a result. His health had been undermined by the labors and anxieties of the campaign, and before the rejoicing of the Republicans was over, Greeley himself lay dead. End of Chapter 2, Part 2. Recording by William Tomko.